Good evening to everybody on the East Coast of the US. Good afternoon to the West Coast, and to everyone in Japan, ohayo gozaimasu. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Matt Marr, and I'm Associate Professor of Sociology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies and the Asian Studies Program at Florida International University in Miami. I think it's the perfect time in any time zone for some caffeine. So I would love to be able to share some Cuban coffee with you, but I don't think that Zoom has come up with a share coffee function yet, so oh well. But welcome to this live webinar on homelessness and the intersection of the COVID-19 pandemic and systemic inequality in the US and Japan. We have simultaneous translation today, so you can adjust the language you hear by using the language options at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to listen to English, please go to the interpretation button and select English. Also, the Q&A is open, so please type your questions and comments there. I will now say that in Japanese to help everyone find their preferred language. 英語と日本語の同時通訳がありますので、日本語でお聞きになりたい方は、画面の下に日本語を選んでください。そしてご質問やコメントがあれば、画面の下の Q&A というところから日本語で書いてください。All four cities represented in this webinar have seen crushing waves of the coronavirus, and unfortunately, Tokyo and Osaka are currently under a state of emergency order. We hope that the situation improves there and across the world as soon as possible. I'd like to thank the panelists for taking their very valuable time to participate in this webinar. I hope this discussion helps you understand your own work more deeply and to learn from other possibilities. But today's webinar is a very unique opportunity. We get to listen to the perspectives of leaders of organizations in the United States and Japan at the front lines of fighting homelessness. By fighting homelessness, I mean both providing food, clothing, housing, employment, and healthcare to persons experiencing homelessness, as well as creating a society that does not push people into the debilitating and traumatic predicament of homelessness or houselessness. The purpose of this panel is to discuss how these organizations' efforts to fight homelessness have been impacted by the ongoing syndemic. A syndemic is when there are two or more pandemics interacting at the same time. Globally, the COVID-19 pandemic is interacting with the longer pandemics of systemic inequality. In the United States, systemic inequality has always taken a racial and ethnic form. This is clear in the disproportionate number of African Americans who are vulnerable to homelessness. It is also evident in the disproportionate number of non-whites vulnerable to infection, illness, and death by COVID-19. Racial and ethnic inequality may be less visible in Japan, but those experiencing street homelessness are disproportionately older men from rural and working class backgrounds. Also, younger male and female workers in low-paying and unstable jobs are increasingly vulnerable to less visible forms of homelessness, like living in internet cafes. Last, these groups, as well as foreign workers in Japan, are disproportionately vulnerable to the broad impacts of COVID-19. This webinar is part of an intellectual exchange program called the US-Japan Service Hub Network, which is funded by the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. This network is a group of researchers and practitioners who work in what geographers call service hub neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods where homelessness, as well as housing, supportive services, and social movements addressing homelessness cluster. These neighborhoods have been created by decades of discriminatory policies that aim to contain poor and racialized populations away from prime spaces slated for development. However, our network is exploring how to enhance these neighborhoods' capacities to not only aid and support, but also liberate marginalized communities from systemic inequality. In the chat, we have posted a link to a file with profiles of the panelists and the four neighborhoods that are the core of our network: Skid Row, Los Angeles, Overtown, Miami, Sanya, Tokyo, and Kamagasaki, Osaka. Each neighborhood has a fascinating history and unique characteristics. The profiles do not do them justice, but they provide a glimpse into these neighborhoods. There are also links and a list of sources on the neighborhoods in the file. I'll just very quickly highlight a few things to try to help the discussion. Skid Row, Los Angeles is a very dense service hub and large in terms of number of residents and organizations. It is east of downtown and in between industrial districts and rapidly gentrifying areas. Residents are predominantly African American, even though African Americans make up only 7% of Los Angeles County's total population. Several thousands of men and women live in permanent subsidized housing and single room occupancy hotels and transitional programs in shelters and on the streets. Miami's service hub is centered in Overtown, north of downtown Miami. It has a smaller population experiencing homelessness than Skid Row, LA, and is spread throughout a residential neighborhood which is predominantly African American and Hispanic and low income. It is also seeing encroachment of gentrification. Kamagasaki, Osaka is Japan's counterpart to Skid Row, LA. It has Japan's highest concentration of street homelessness and poverty. Many residents are older single men who worked as day laborers, but now live in single room occupancy hotels, and many are supported by welfare. Japan's Seikatsu Hogo, or livelihood protection program, is one reason that Japan has a much lower rate of street homelessness than the United States. It is somewhat similar to a minimum basic income. The area around Kamagasaki on the south of Osaka's loop train line is being targeted for tourism-related redevelopment. Sanya, Tokyo is smaller than Kamagasaki in terms of population and number of organizations and is located just northeast of Tokyo's loop train line. Sanya has slowly transformed in recent decades so that now at first look, it seems like any other neighborhood in working class Tokyo. But there is still a concentration of single room occupancy hotels with residents on livelihood protection, many of them former day laborers. There's also a concentration of street homelessness and aid organizations. Sanya and nearby areas have also been the target of redevelopment for tourism. Now I'm very excited to introduce our panelists. They're all extremely accomplished and dedicated people. First, Daigo Kobayashi is lead case manager for NPO Kamagasaki, an organization which provides shelter, employment, and supportive services to poor and unhoused residents of Kamagasaki, Osaka. He was born and raised in Nishinari, the ward encompassing Kamagasaki. For 15 years in Nishinari, he is engaged in support activities for children, persons living in poverty, and the unhoused. Amid the coronavirus pandemic, he has taken a leadership role in creating a network of young people active in Nishinari Ward. Second is Pete White. Pete White is the founder and co-director of Los Angeles Community Action Network, or LA CAN. LA CAN focuses on developing indigenous leadership, housing and civil rights, healthy food access, women's rights, and violence prevention. Pete and LA CAN have made extremely important impacts on addressing homelessness in LA, including pressuring government to preserve precious housing resources and protecting civil liberties and rights of residents inside and outside of Skid Row. Third, Kazunori Yui is director of Sanyuso, a men's shelter, and senior administrator of Sanyukai in Sanya, Tokyo. For over 30 years, Sanyukai has provided free medical services, food, clothing, counseling, and other supportive services to poor men, many of whom have been day laborers and or unhoused. Yui-san has worked in Sanya for over 15 years. He also works with community organizations in and around Sanya to enhance social services. Last is Miami's own Hilda Fernandez. She is Chief Executive Officer of Camillus House. She leads a complex system of care serving more than 12,500 men, women, and children each year through over 40 programs and services. Ms. Fernandez has worked to address homelessness in Miami for many years in various roles. She is former executive director of the Miami-Dade County Homeless Trust and is a board member of the Florida Coalition for the Homeless and Miami Homes for All. So I'm going to ask panelists a few questions about how their organizations and objectives have been impacted by the ongoing syndemic. There will be an approximately 50-minute discussion. Then after a brief but special spoken word performance, we will have a Q&A with the panelists. Please feel free to post questions and comments in the Q&A in English or Japanese. So I'm going to start off with this first question. It's kind of a set of questions. So, and I'm going to ask each panelist to respond for about 5 minutes. So what was your organization's immediate reaction to the coronavirus pandemic? What have been your major areas of relief since the pandemic began? And what have been some of your major challenges? And what have been some of your major successes? I would like to start, if I may, with Kobayashi-san from Osaka.
よろしくお願いいたします。小林大吾と申します。まずコロナによって、即時的な反応というところなんですけども、我々釜ヶ崎ではリーマンショックの再来を危惧しました。リーマンショックの時は全国から釜ヶ崎に、失業して職を求める方が多数押し寄せて、その人たちが、ホームレス状態になってしまうということが起きてしまいました。今回のコロナ禍でも同じような状況になるのではないかということを危惧して、対応が迫られることになりました。リーマンショックの時に関しては、あまりにも多数の、失業者が溢れ出したことによって、我々支援団体も対応が追いつかないことがあったので、そうならないように、まず、釜ヶ崎にはたくさんの、支援団体があるんですけども、その、連携体制を構築いたしました。結果的に、大阪市内で、困窮者支援団体や、医療関係、法律関係、不動産会社、宿泊施設などの、団体、20以上の団体が連携することができました。で、その中で、主な救援活動ということなんですけども、連携した、目的としては、一つは大きな看板作りということを目的としていました。コロナ禍の中で、世の中にありとあらゆる情報が、溢れ返りって、自分に必要な情報が見つけにくい、事態となりました。困窮して、仕事を失って住まいを失った方が自分に必要な情報を探すために、ことがすごく、困難な状態だったため、大阪中の、いろんな団体が一つの、看板を上げることによって見つけやすく、かつ、安心、信頼できる情報を届けようということを一つ目の目的としました。二つ目の目的といたしましては、支援の質の向上ということで、一つの窓口で、あらゆる課題を解決できるような体制を整えました。それが福祉的相談であったり、医療、法律、仕事、就職ですね、などの相談を一つの窓口でできることにより、スピーディーにかつより専門的な支援が実施できるような体制を整えました。で、また、3つ目に社会資源の共有ということで、今回連携した中で各団体ごとでそれぞれ持っているリソースを、一つのテーブルの上にみんなで並べて、各団体がそれぞれ自由に使えるような体制を整えることができました。その結果、相談者、僕たちが対応する、ホームレス状態の人たちの課題に、それぞれ一人一人のニーズに合った支援を提供することができるようになりました。で、また資金の調達を、連携団体で、共同で行いました。一つの大きな財布を作るということで、クラウドファンディングを実施して、700万円以上の、資金を集めることができました。その資金に関しては、緊急宿泊支援や食料支援など、住まいを失った方、食べる、食事に困っている方に、 宿泊先の提供だったり、食料を提供する、ことを目的に集めました。で、実際、行っている支援、今まで行ってきた支援に関しては、緊急相談会の開催であったり、宿泊支援や食料支援や、就労支援、また、生活保護申請のお手伝いなど、さまざまな、各ホームレス状態の方の、困っていることに応じて対応していきました。はい、ざっとこんな感じになります。
Great, thank you very much, Kobayashi-san. Maybe now if I could throw the mic over to Pete in LA to hear about how LA Can kind of responded immediately and what your challenges and successes have been.
So first and foremost, thanks Matt and FIU for having me in this conversation, and thank you to all of my colleagues and comrades who are here sharing today. I know it's been really trying times during this past year, and I'm sure folks are still struggling with the syndemic. In Los Angeles, it's been very interesting times, and so pre-pandemic, a lot of the work that we had been doing in terms of elevating the structural root causes of poverty and homelessness uncovered structural racism in a way that elected officials could not back away from. And so in Los Angeles, pre-pandemic and now during the pandemic, the conversation, the rhetoric, the political rhetoric is about segregation being a root cause, redlining being a root cause for houselessness, right? Banishment being a root cause for houselessness, right? All of these things that we've known, right, but have created sort of a political environment where it's toxic if you don't talk about houselessness from the structural sort of vantage point that we find it, right? We've organized around the ideas that houselessness, particularly Black houselessness in Los Angeles, can be tracked back to deindustrialization, tracked back to the war on drugs, which is really the war on people of color in our communities. We can take it back to NAFTA. We can take it back to the prison industrial boom in California during the war years. And so we find ourselves in a place where the political family or the powers that be easily talk about these things. However, the response, right? The response isn't a response that is atoning for the past, or it's not a response that is looking for repair or reparations. It's a doubling down or a tripling down on trying to rename the same tactics over. I say all of that because when COVID-19, when we realized, the pandemic was headed in our direction, we knew for a fact that a lot of the language coming out of the CDC and the Department of Public Health and local politicians' mouths would never apply to poor people. And so things like stay at home, like what does stay at home mean for houseless folks or for marginally housed folks, right? Shelter in place, like what does that mean for houseless folks or marginally housed folks, right? And there were no answers to that. The early estimates was that, the pandemic, COVID-19, would sweep through houselessness. And I'm sure this is something we heard, globally, that houseless folks would be just devastated by the pandemic. I'm happy to report that houseless folks that were outside, and I'll talk a little bit about the things that we had to do, were not hit with COVID-19 in Skid Row in ways in which the entire city thought they would be. Now, COVID-19 inside of our shelters, that did happen. Like the Union Rescue Mission and a couple of other places, indoor places, they did have a reckoning with COVID-19. But however, folks on the outside, not so much. We knew from the jump, from the word go, that one, there would be no PPE provided for poor and houseless people in Los Angeles. And so we immediately went about the business of finding allies and comrades and supporters who would make masks, who could get masks imported from other places so we could begin to protect our community, right? I have to take my hat off to even corporations like Skywell and other folks who said, yo, Pete, do y'all have masks? Have the city stepped in? And of course, the answer was no. In Skid Row, I know we talked a bit about it. There's roughly 4,500 people living outside in the fifth largest economy in the world, right? In they say a 50 square block area, but because of gentrification, that area has become very compressed. So it's like a 30 square block area, right? When the shelter in order place came, right, of course, folks with the stay-at-home orders stayed at home and charitable giving dropped, right, immediately. The picture that you saw, if you were looking at the picture on the announcement, it was a picture in the middle of Skid Row. Our Wellness and Justice Center is based in the middle of Skid Row. And that was our immediate response to our members and our neighbors who were showing up at our doors. And so I say that when folks were saying shelter in place, everyone ran away. But many Angelenos ran toward help, ran towards mutual aid. And so we had to quickly, like we're a political organization. We're an organization that's doing policy work, right? We're involved in innovations. We're never that organization that's passing out meals and tents. But we had to quickly become that organization because the streets were crickets, right? And so we had to source PPE. We had to create a mutual aid infrastructure, right? That sourced tents, right? We had to create, because even prior to the pandemic, Skid Row, we've battled for public health infrastructure. Think about this. Skid Row, 5,000 folks on the streets. We have consultative status with the United Nations. We've been talking about public health infrastructure, fighting for it for 10, 15 years. And so when the pandemic hit, there's literally, for these 5,000 folks who live outside, right? But in the community, there's about 15,000 folks living inside and outside. There were 5 restrooms, right? And no real running water and no soap. And so we had to look, as we usually do in our models, we had to look at other models when pandemics happen, other models across the globe that we could replicate to at least provide a stopgap measure until we could create the political power necessary to make the powers that be respond. So we looked at what the Congolese did in Africa during the SARS, and we actually created rain barrels. So we took rain barrels, we brought in artists, community artists who painted these beautiful images and these instructions around hand washing, how many times you need to hand wash. And we made about 100 of these, what we call survival sanitation stations, that we deployed all across Los Angeles. Because had we not done that, the whole idea of washing your hands 2 and 3 times a day or an hour would never have happened. We were able, through mutual aid, to train promotores, community residents, who could then understand at that time what we knew, or what we thought we knew about the pandemic, in terms of the need to wash hands, the needs to mask up. I wish I could say we would be happy to say, I wish we didn't have to say this. Up to this date, we've had to provide like 70,000 hand washing situations, 85,000 meals and tents and masks, right? Because there was no help coming, right? And so it took us a number of months to finally build the infrastructure that made the city respond. And that went everywhere from testing. Like we had to, even with COVID-19 testing, we had to partner up with community health clinics, because, you know, if you looked on the news and you saw the Dodger Stadium and you saw these high profile testing places, that testing didn't happen in Skid Row or South Central Los Angeles or Boyle Heights. And so we had to create the infrastructure to bring in public health officials and community clinics to help create the design to test folks in Skid Row. So I'll just close it there. I'll just say we knew early on that help would not be on the way. However, the spirit of mutual aid that came from Angelinos, right? Angelinos, everyday Angelinos, helped us hold it down in areas like Skid Row.
Thank you, Pete. And I'm glad you mentioned the hand washing stations. I really wanted to hear about that. And I heard other folks talk about, even though there was a stay-at-home order, people like yourself and everybody in LA Can felt the need to do something and looked at it as a form of civil disobedience to go out and do that mutual aid. And I just want to note that I think a lot of social movements emerge out of mutual aid. So there's that connection there as well. So thank you very much for that, and we'll get back to more of what you all have been doing there. But I wanted to hear also from Tokyo, from Yui-san in Tokyo, to hear what the immediate reaction was to the pandemic and the kind of the major efforts were.
はい、三遊会のゆいです。よろしくお願いします。三遊会は、先ほどマットさんの紹介にもありましたけど、無料診療所の運営をしたり、生活相談、炊き出し、アウトリーチ、食堂での昼食の提供、居場所生きがいづくりプロジェクト、サンヤアートプロジェクト、一人暮らしが難しい元ホームレスの方のためのケア付きの住まいの運営を行っています。新型コロナウイルスの感染拡大が、始まってからですね、山谷地域は、高齢のホームレスの人が多かったり、ですかね、山谷地域に住んでいる人も高齢者の人が多いということもあったので、感染を防止していかなきゃいけないということが大きな課題になりました。その中で私たちの活動も、無料診療所の運営と生活相談、炊き出し、アウトリーチは続けていったんですけども、食堂での昼食の提供や居場所生きがいづくりプロジェクト、サンヤアートプロジェクトの活動は、中止せざるを得ないような状況になってしまいました。やはり事務所が狭いので、そこに人がたくさん集まってしまうような活動は感染を防ぐために、中止しなければいけないというような状況がありました。また、新型コロナウイルスの感染が拡大する前は、たくさんのボランティアの方によって活動が支えられていたんですけれども、もうそれもたくさんの人が集まってしまうので、ボランティアの方の参加も制限しなければいけないような状況になってしまいました。で、ただ、その中で、感染対策を限られたスペースと人手の中で感染対策をどのようにしていくかということを継続的に話し合いを続けていってですね、その中で対策が取れたものから少しずつ元に戻していくっていうようなことをやってます。ただ、その食堂での昼食の提供っていうのは、ホームレスの方であったり、山谷地域に住んでいる方たちが食事を食べに来るということで、新型コロナウイルスの感染が広まる前には、それをきっかけにしてたくさんの人たちが山陽会に集まってきてくれていたんですけども、その活動はどうしてもやっぱり人がたくさん集まってしまうので、今も再開はできていません。ので、食堂の活動が中止したことによって、関わりが薄くなってしまった人たちが多くなってしまったっていうような状況があります。ただ、そういった状況に対して、少しでも何かしていこうということで、その代わりにですね、食堂がストップした代わりにお弁当を作って、上野駅が近いんですけども、上野駅の周りにいるホームレスの人たちが食堂によくご飯を食べに来てくれていたので、その方たちに月2回お弁当を持って届けに行こうっていうような取り組みをするっていうような形で、少しずつできる範囲で活動を続けていっているっていうような状況です。で、さっき小林さんのお話だと、やっぱり新たに生活に困窮する方たちに対応していくっていう問題があったと思うんですけども、山谷地域はもちろん全くそういった方がいないわけではないんですけども、どちらかというと東京では新宿とか 池袋とか、もう少し大規模なターミナル駅があるようなエリアでの支援活動に新たに生活に困窮された方たちが集中するっていうような状況が起きてるのかなというふうに思ってます。もちろんただ私たちもそういった方に対して対応していくようにということでフリーダイヤルを開設したりメールでの相談を始めたり、ですね、あと宿泊費の援助をしたりっていうことを、やっているところです。以上です。
Thank you, Yui-san. And I've had the pleasure of being a volunteer at Sanyukai, and I know that the patients and the volunteers and the men in the neighborhood are really like a family. And it sounds like that was disrupted, but I know that you all are doing your best efforts to kind of maintain those relationships. So next, I'd like to hear from Hilda Fernandez about the situation in Miami and kind of how Camillus House has responded.
Certainly, and good morning for some of you and good afternoon for some other of you. So we treated the pandemic like we do a natural disaster. We treated it as an emergency response. In Miami, our typical natural disaster is a hurricane. So what we did is take our emergency response plan and approach it in such a way. And what does that mean? An emergency response looks at the issue, identifies short-term and long-term solutions to the issues, identifies needed resources to address the issue, who has to do it, and by when. In this case, obviously, just like when we protect our clients from a hurricane, we're really focused on the safety and health of the clients we serve inside our facilities. In particular, this facility, our large facility where we house about 400 people, as well as those clients that we serve in the community in our 10 other sites. So we focus, and by the way, it's congregate living. Our main facility is congregate living. So we knew immediately we had to do something to ensure that the clients living so closely and sleeping so closely and cohabitating so closely to each other were going to be kept safe. And that included everything from physical modifications. We retrofitted spaces with negative pressure and UV lighting. So we would have our own quarantine and isolation rooms in the event someone potentially was infected. We could separate them from the general population. We had to do behavior modification, everything from installing wash stations to requiring people to wash their hands before they went into dining rooms, you name it, enforcing social distancing, mandating the use of masks almost from the very beginning. Process changes. We were one of the few facilities that said, we think we can try to contain within our facility the issue by the cleaning and the processes we're doing, but we cannot control when someone goes out of our community and goes into a convenience store or wherever and touches and gets exposed to other people and then risk them bringing it back to our congregate setting. So yes, we implemented a pass system. So if you had a reason to leave, we gave you a pass and you could go. But unless you had a reason to leave, we wanted you to kind of stay within this cocoon of safety that we were trying to create. An intense cleaning and disinfecting program that involved increasing our staff support, which God bless our staff. They are the true heroes who had to work major overtime and extra time to keep our facility clean. And that meant while people were sleeping, while our residents were sleeping, they were putting ozone generators in common rooms. They were spraying down hallways and elevators and doorknobs and doors and you name it so that we could disinfect the space. So when our clients woke up in the morning, they were in a clean environment. And of course, a lot of times securing resources. That's a reality at the very beginning when everybody was struggling to get personal protective equipment and everything else we needed to keep our clients safe. We convened a planning group and God bless our staff is the best. We love our people. They're very outside the box thinkers. And we met every 3 days, Saturday, Sunday, whenever we had to meet. So we could quickly adjust when we saw things changing and moving, so we wouldn't be behind the curve, so we could quickly make those adjustments. Informing our clients of what was going on was crucial. We started doing these client advisories in multi-language, you know, they're bilingual, so that everyone understood what we were doing and why we were doing it, because, you know, folks are affected and they deserve to understand that we're not trying to do something to them, but trying to do something for them. And I think with that communication, it made life easier for us. You know, there was one common goal from the very beginning, and that was we have to stay open, because no matter what, we know that our clients are safer inside our walls than out in the community, where they're at a greater risk of becoming infected. And unlike offices, dental office or an insurance agency, that they could go home and telecommute and do everything, we don't have that option. Our clients need to be fed and housed. They need to talk to caseworkers. They need to speak to their mental health counselors, because they're at incredible stress. We had to come to work and we needed to stay open. So we just needed to make that environment safe for our clients, and especially for our workers. And I got to tell you, one of the biggest frustrations and challenges from the very beginning was that, you know, hats off to our nurses and our doctors, our respiratory techs, the people that are in the trenches in the hospitals, working with very sick people and keeping them alive and helping them get well. But I got to take my hat off to our workers, our people, our staff that came to work every single day, didn't know if they were being exposed to anything, because at the very beginning, we did not have access to testing, and didn't know if they were exposed to anything, and were going home every night to their own families, not knowing if they were taking something home to their families. And they showed up every day. They stepped ahead and said, this is important to us. Like it was mentioned, it's been a challenge. For example, we provide the only day center where homeless individuals can come in and take a shower, change of clothing, pick up mail, get a hot breakfast, get lunch. And we were committed to continuing to provide that, because if we stopped doing that, how was that going to happen? So all we had to figure out is, how do we make that happen in a way that does not in any way endanger our resident population? So yes, we could not allow our street homeless to come into our dining room to have breakfast or lunch. So we started doing bagged lunch and breakfast. We opened a corner lot that we own. We put picnic tables out there, disinfectant spray, wiped that down every day after, and we made that available and gave them the food to eat there. We let those that could come inside, if they were willing to get screened, could come in and be taken to take a shower. We continued to do mail service, but we did it from our front desk rather than having them come inside. But it was essential for us to figure out, how could we continue to do this? How could we diminish the impact to the availability of beds, so that our clients can continue to be housed, because they're going to be safer inside these walls and outside. And B, how could we continue to serve that community of homeless people that live around our shelter and still needed these services? But one of the frustrations, I got to tell you, was just making the argument that our staff needed to be equally accessible to testing, needed to be equally accessible to the means to continue to serve our clients. We cannot serve our clients without healthy staff. And if our staff got sick, that was going to pose a problem. So it's been so hard to kind of put ahead, the job that our frontline workers do on a daily basis in working with our clients to make sure our clients could be safe, that our people that we serve in our community and in our residential programs could stay safe. That has been a huge challenge. And I got to tell you, just like Pete, man, the community outpouring of support, when we were at the lowest and what have you, people who showed up with masks made out of right now, we just received masks made out of old Miami Heat basketball shorts. And we took them. It was all good for us. So, so many people just showed up with homemade masks, dropped off water, dropped off food for our workers who worked, were working 18-hour shifts at the very beginning. That was such an incredible moment that we saw in our community, that people saw, hey, something's going on there, and what's happening to the poor and the poor. And I know we're going to talk about it later, but what I really walked away from in this experience is, I think, a heightened awareness of so many people in our community have, if not for the fact that there is an eviction moratorium, would be homeless today. So this increased number of people that have faced the reality of that thing called one paycheck away from homelessness isn't a pretty story told by diehard, crying liberals or what have you. It is a reality. And we faced that in our community because we're a tourism-based economy. And that was the most impacted economy in this incredible issue. So I think it's also been, we're going to talk about that a little bit else, a rude awakening for a lot of folks that did not appreciate that it is not a fancy story being told to raise money. It is the truth. Many people in our community live one paycheck away from homelessness. And when you don't have an alternative place, this isn't about one restaurant closing and you trying to find a job at another restaurant. Every restaurant closed, every hotel, you name it. And what happens when that happens and all of the economies that tie up to supporting this tourism base that we have.
Thank you, Hilda. And that gives us a lot of insight into the complexities of managing things in a large congregate facility and how difficult that must be. The next question or set of questions I'd like to ask is, how does each panelist, and I'm going to ask Kobayashi-san first, but how do you think the COVID pandemic has worsened social and economic inequality that is at the root of homelessness? And in particular, have you seen any new groups vulnerable to homelessness or new needs related to the pandemic? So Kobayashi-san, please.
そうですね。まず、他の方々も言ってた部分でもあるんですけども、日本でも、マスクが不足した状態になりました。値段も高騰してしまい、手に入らない状態の中で、路上で生活している、ホームレス状態の人たちが購入することはとても難しい状態となりました。でまたステイホームということは日本でも、叫ばれていたんですが、帰る場所がない人、帰る家がない人が、日本にもいる中で、そういった方たちが昼間、開放されていたフリースペース、居場所というものも閉鎖されたり、炊き出しがなくなってしまったりしてしまうような状態になりました。現在は、かなり、炊き出し等もまた再度再開していたり、感染対策を行った上で、日中の居場所なども開放されるようになったんですけども、当時は、かなり、各団体ごとに、どうしていくかっていうことが、皆さん悩んでたとともに、どこの炊き出しがなくなって、どこの、居場所が閉まってるかっていうような情報も、錯綜してしまって、我々支援者にとってもかなり混乱した状態が招かれていました。でマスクについて少しお話しさせていただきますと、マスクがなくなってしまったことにより、地域の、訪問看護を行っている団体が、アイリン手作りマスクプロジェクトという、プロジェクトを立ち上げて、インターネットなどを使って、アイリン地区釜ヶ崎にいるホームレス状態の人たちなどに向けて、手作りのマスクを寄付してもらうプロジェクトを行って、その結果多数のマスクが集まり、より、なんていうんですかね、感染リスクが下がる不織布のマスクではないものの、多くの方に、マスクを、ホームレス状態の方にマスクをお配りすることができました。でまた日本では特別定額給付金という国からの給付金が一度だけ、全国民ですかね、に、支給されることになりました。ただ、ホームレス状態の方は、住所がなかったり、住所が設定されていても、そこに住んでいる実態がなかったり、郵便物を受け取れないというような、課題を抱えていました。釜ヶ崎では、支援団体が、行政と、交渉を繰り返した結果、釜ヶ崎の中にあるホームレス状態の人のための無料のシェルターに、住民票を設定することが認められ、また、そこに郵便物を、届けることも認められました。その結果、ホームレス状態の方でも、 特別定額給付金、1回ぽっきりの、10万円なんですけど、10万円の金額なんですけども、を受け取るようなことができました。ワクチンに関しても、このアイリンシェルター、シェルターでの住民設定をもとに、もしくは、シェルターで住民設定をしなくても郵便物を受け取れることにより、ワクチンを受け取れるような、仕組みを今現在構築中です。また、ちょっと余談になるんですけど、ワクチンに関しては日本はまだまだ、接種率が進んでいません。現在、4% の方が、ワクチンを接種している状態です。で、また大阪、釜ヶ崎のある大阪では、コロナの感染者が、かなり増加しており、現在、緊急事態宣言中なんですが、医療体制がかなり逼迫しています。そういった状況の中で、やはりその、ホームレス状態の方たちの対応っていうのは、後回しになってしまっているという状況はありますね。はい。で、あとは、そんな感じで、新しいニーズっていうところに関しましては、そうですね、結構今回の、新型コロナの、感染を通じて、コロナ禍を通じて、生活保護制度の申請っていうのが増えました。今までは、山屋とかもそうなのかもしれないんですけども、リーマンショックの頃とかは、失業したらとりあえず、釜ヶ崎に行く。で、そこで釜ヶ崎の支援団体が、生活保護の申請のお手伝いをするっていうようなことがあって、釜ヶ崎を要する大阪市西成区の、保健事務所ですね、区役所では、生活保護の申請件数が増える傾向にあったんですけども、今回のコロナ禍では、西成区が突出して、増えたわけではなく、西成区以外の各区も、全体的に、総じて増えたということから、生活保護制度が今回のコロナ禍を通じてぐっと身近になった部分もあるなというふうには感じております。はい。そんなもん。こんなもんでいいですかね。はい。以上になります。
Thank you, Kobayashi-san, and maybe I'll have some follow-ups to that a little bit later in the Q&A, but I want to give some time to some of the other folks. So Pete, I know you already touched on this a little bit in the first part, in answering the first question, but you know, how do you, if you want to add anything about how the COVID pandemic has maybe worsened social and economic inequality at the root of homelessness, or maybe seeing new vulnerable groups or new needs related to the pandemic. If you have any things you want to add to your other comments.
So I'll just be really, really brief. So pre-pandemic, LA County, 66,000 houseless folks. We know empirically that was an undercount. The methods that are used to count have come under question and scrutiny. But the untold number, what no one talked about. So when we knew about the 66,000, no one really talked about the 350,000 families in Los Angeles that were barely hanging on, right? Those who are marginally housed. And so those 350,000 families equaled 1.2 million people pre-pandemic that could be added easily to the houseless range, right? In Los Angeles, 201 persons are made homeless per day. And so what that says, pre-pandemic, it illustrates the deep levels of inequality that exists around race and gender lines, just to keep it real. Now, fast forward in the pandemic, we just ran data. African-Americans, 40% of African-Americans are at least 4 months behind on rent. The number of folks, families who are at risk now have increased from that 350,000 to, in Los Angeles, we have a conservative estimate of 500,000 families who are behind on rent and who will begin to fall out as soon as these moratoriums are lifted. The Aspen Institute just released a number for Los Angeles that's 650,000 families. And so what we're saying is we have not begun to see the manifestation yet of the deep levels of inequality that's going to be really exposed when the pandemic lifts, or not the pandemic, but the moratoriums lift. And as you quip about the different faces, of course, you are going to see many different faces, right, of houselessness. As Hilda said, you know, one restaurant didn't close, they all closed. One mall didn't close, they all closed, right? Entire sectors closed. And so we anticipate, you know, informal settlements cropping up unless on the federal side, something like rent forgiveness is ushered in on the local side and on the state side. If not, we can't even imagine what I believe we're going to see across this country in the next few months and in the incoming years.
Right. Thanks, Pete. And you know, the announcement today from Joe Biden was that we can take our masks off, but we know that this thing isn't over. You know, that we're just about to see some more unfortunately bleak impacts of things. But I wanted to ask Yui-san in Tokyo to see if he had anything to add on this issue. If you think the COVID pandemic has worsened inequalities that you see in Sanya, and if you've seen any new groups vulnerable to homelessness or new needs. You touched on it a little bit in your earlier comments, but if you have something to add.
はい、ありがとうございます。新しくホームレスになった人とか、生活に困窮した人たちのお話を聞いてみると、飲食業とか観光業のように、今回の新型コロナウイルスの感染拡大によって影響を受けた産業の人たちで、かつ、契約職員さんとか、なんていうんですかね、期間限定で働いているような方たちとか、不安定な雇用条件で働いている人が、より、ホームレスになりやすかったりとか、生活に困窮しやすいような状況になっているのかなっていうふうに思っています。ので、なんでしょうね。そういう人たちが、もちろんその新型コロナウイルスの感染拡大っていうのは、一つの大きな、きっかけではあったんですけども、おそらくその前から不安定な生活状況にある方が比較的多かったのかなということで、なんですかね、新型コロナウイルスが、不平等を悪化させたっていうよりかは、どっちかというとより表面化させたっていうような、状況なのかなっていうふうに、個人的には思ってます。で、山谷地域は、日雇い労働者が多い地域ですけども、もう、日雇い労働といっても、建設業とかにの日雇いの仕事をしている人が多い地域だったので、どっちかっていうと、もともと建設業の日雇いの仕事自体が新型コロナウイルスに関係なく少なくなっていたので、すごい、なんていうんでしょうね、大きな影響があったっていうよりかは、どっちか行政が、そういう、山谷地域の、日雇い労働者の人の失業者対策として、仕事を公共事業として、定期的に、提供するっていうようなプログラムがあるんですけども、それが一時的に、中止になったりすることで、山谷地域の、日雇い労働の人たちの生活が、より大変になったっていうようなことはありました。今はまた復活はしてるんですけども、ただ、前みたいに、なんですかね、日雇い労働のそういう仕事って、マイクロバスに、たくさんの人数、40人、50人ぐらいがいっぺんに乗って仕事に行くっていうような、形だったんですけども、それはやっぱり、バスの中が、人がいっぱいになって、感染のリスクが高くなってしまうということで、人数を減らすっていうことで、1日あたりに紹介される仕事の件数が減っちゃったりとかっていうことはあるみたいですけども、そういった状況ですかね。で、さっき小林さんが特別定額給付金とワクチンの話してくれてて、その特別定額給付金の話はやっぱりそのホームレスの方にとってはかなり不利な状況があったなと思ってて、東京も、自立支援センターっていう、東京都がやっているシェルターが、東京23区で運営しているシェルターがあるんですけども、そこに入って住民登録すれば、 特別定額給付金を受け取れるっていうような形になっていたんですけども、それはそれで受け取れる一つの、仕組みができたっていうことでは評価できると思うんですけども、一方で、やっぱり、なんですか、そういうシェルターに入ることを条件にして、ホームレスでなくなることをある意味条件にして、そういう特別定額給付金が受け取れるっていうような形になっているっていうところでは、なかなか、特別定額給付金っていうのは何のためにやってるのかっていうと、日本ではそういう新型コロナウイルスの影響で、みんなが生活に困る、生活に影響があるだろうから、それに対して、給付しましょうということで、全国民を対象にしてやってるはずなんですよね。ただ、一部のそのホームレスの人とかに関しては、ホームレス状態にならない、もちろんホームレス状態にならなくなることはいいことなんですけども、シェルターに入るってことが条件になってしまったっていうことがありました。
Great. Thank you, Yui-san. So I'd like to maybe hear from Hilda about Miami, and maybe in particular, since Pete brought up the situation of, and you also touched upon this about how a lot of people are, when the eviction moratorium is we already are seeing some evictions, but when that fully is removed, we'll see kind of waves of new people vulnerable to homelessness. But I know Camillus House has run a lot of the rapid rehousing programs locally in Miami to try to keep people in housing. So maybe you could explain a little bit about how that's going.
Absolutely. So we've been the recipient of two of the big pots of money that came down from the federal government, what they call the CARES Act funding. The county's funding, it's a little $9.7 million, and the vast majority of that is intended to be used for rapid rehousing to move clients through the homeless system, either from the street directly or through out of our shelter system into permanent housing, with a component of that money also being available for homeless prevention. So we've been waiting and waiting for that moratorium, with the eventuality of what's going to happen when that moratorium finally is done, and folks are going to be faced with the reality that their landlords don't want them to stay. So to be clear, there's millions and millions of dollars that have come into this community, of upwards of $60 million in American Rescue Act money that can be used by individuals of any income level practically to be able to pay rent if they're behind in rent. But that's assuming that their landlord wants to accept the rent. We understand there's going to be some folks that, some landlords that are going to take advantage of this horrible situation, this pandemic, and for the people who can least afford it, not be willing to accept even those resources. The truth of the matter is, when you're talking about inequality and, and impact on homelessness, safe housing is no doubt one of the greatest safety nets to prevent the spread of communicable disease. And so when you don't have the benefit, it's like, not having clean drinking water. So, there's so many components to health and safety. And, when you are at the poorest bottom of the rung of the ladder, then you're not going to have access to the conditions that are going to help keep you safe and healthy. You want to talk inequality? Look, the testing system in Miami-Dade County, professor, initially you needed to go register online to go get a test. I mean, think of that. What homeless person living out on the street is, so of course, what do we have to do? Let's just take our testing to the street. So those are the adjustments that we made. We redirected our specialized outreach teams to go out and do street testing, because it's unrealistic to think that poor people with limited access to the internet are going to go and sit down and try to fight for the slots to be able to go get tested, and often not very convenient places to get tested, and not very convenient hours. It's not as if they were doing it after work for those few people that were working. So, access to PPEs, not everybody could go buy those fancy masks and what have you. Often they were having to rely on other means of personal protection, which happen to be the least effective means, such as, gaiters or, cloth masks or what have you. So, social inequality has a humongous impact on the reaction and the especially on the way that poor people can protect themselves from from something like this, a pandemic of this nature. And let alone the fact that communication, what are the means of communication to these poor, to the poor folk? Are there the most effective means of communication being used, the means that work, that are effective with individuals that aren't sitting down watching their 52-inch television every night and 24 hours of news telling them what to do to stay safe and healthy, or where's the quickest and fastest place to go in your car to get vaccinated or to get a test. So, you do see really the impact of, how the systems really, unfortunately, the systems that roll out the quickest are not the ones that are going to be the most effective in serving the poorest and the poorest, which tend to be the folks who need those systems the most, those resources the most. So I would tell you, as it is, homeless individuals generally would be considered at a higher risk of getting sick, only because of the very nature of the poor nutrition that homeless individuals often suffer from by living on the street. So we already see high incidence of hypertension and diabetes, which are, hypertension and diabetes, are two of those identified vulnerability risks for people who are out there and at risk of being more vulnerable to a pandemic, such like COVID, that affects your system. So, it's really it's been a challenge for I think for us to try to elevate the homeless as being a priority population. Not suggesting that older folks in an ALF or an assisted living facility should not have been taken care of, but why not take a look at the living conditions of homeless individuals in congregate settings, or even those on the street? Look, I got to give kudos to, I got to say though, in Miami, they rented out hotels. There have been quarantine and isolation hotels in place since May of last year, a full year that, the Homeless Trust stepped forward, rented out 5 places, 2 full humongous hotels, 2 flag hotels, a Red Roof and a Hampton Inn, and took over a small ALF to deal with older homeless. So, they've been out there, they've spent the bucks, they've staffed it, they've resourced it, there's testing now, vaccinations, and an effort to try to move people who are willing and able to come off the street, and give them a safe place to, to quarantine and to isolate if in fact they have been infected or exposed. But the truth of the matter is those are the ones who make it into that circle, right? What happens to the people on the verge of homelessness, at the lower rungs of the ladder, again, near homeless, and we know there's lots of near homeless. Those are the ones that became very vulnerable. They lost jobs. Many of them lost health benefits along with those jobs. What happened to those folks, and how quickly were they able to adapt to make sure they could stay safe and healthy in a changing world that we've had to deal with?
Great. Thank you, Hilda. And I think I know Pete could speak to some of the maybe limitations of the hotels program as it's been operated in Los Angeles, as well as maybe some of the opportunities of that. And I think the inequalities that you pointed out, they're unfolding with the vaccine as well. You hear a lot of talk in the media about hesitancy, but then accessibility is a bigger issue for people that are working and things like that. But I would like to open up the Q&A a little bit more. And so I encourage you to, out there in the audience, to submit questions, especially you FIU students out there. I know you can come up with better questions than I can. But before we get into that, I would like to turn things over or have a little bit of a breather here with a spoken word performance. It's really brief, 2 or 3 minutes. And it's going to be performed by my friend, Gary Allen. And Gary has experienced homelessness and until recently was artist in residence at Camillus House. And he was leading an art therapy program there, really building a community through that. And he and other residents have participated in a photo voice research project that uses photography and captions, in Gary's case, poetry, to document their experiences living in a congregate housing program during the pandemic and all that involved. So Gary has lived through it all. recently he moved into housing, is now doing work at Hampton House. So some of you who aren't from Miami may have heard of Hampton House, or you may have not, but Hampton House is a historical landmark in the Black community in Miami and was recently featured in the film One Night in Miami. So during this whole syndemic, Gary has gone from Camillus House to Hampton House, all while helping the people around him. So he's going to perform an original piece called Warriors Do Something. And I think it really speaks to the efforts that our panelists have described that they and their organizations and their volunteers and staff have engaged in. There's not going to be simultaneous interpretation. So please change your language to English or the main floor for his performance. And then we'll also post the poem in the chat. It's also in the handout. But then we'll get back to the Q&A right after that. So Rigo, please pin the camera on Gary, and Gary, please do your poem.
Well, first of all, thank you, Matt, for that wonderful introduction, and for the shout out for the Hampton House. I know my aunt would appreciate that. So I wrote something, and it says, in these times of uncertainty, fear, worry, and doubt, I pray that this poem will be a blessing and an inspiration. And like Matt said, the name of this poem is called Warriors Do Something, but I also have a second title for it, which is called Warriors, the Battle Cry by Gary A. Allen. And it goes like this. Warriors, 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 warriors. Warriors don't lay down while the battle rages on. They get up, they stand up. Warriors are strong. Warriors prepare for battle. Warriors make a stand. Warriors take courage when the battle is at hand. Warriors never give up. They push past the pain. Warriors are facing their fears, and warriors still remain. Warriors, 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 warriors. They fight the good fight. Their eyes are on the prize, and they never lose sight of the goal. Warriors take hold. Warriors are brave, and warriors are bold. They step to the plate. They're walking in faith. Warriors know when to move, and warriors know when to wait. Warriors are patient, and warriors are kind. Warriors are gentle, and they have a sound mind. Warriors got a choice. Warriors got a voice. Warriors finish their course. Warriors count the cost. Warriors suffer the loss. Warriors pay. Warriors stay. Warriors pray. Warriors, they love their neighbors, and they love themselves too. That's what warriors do. I am a warrior. What about you?
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, and I think that kind of captures some of the spirit of the efforts that everybody's been engaged in, and will continue to engage in as we continue to fight through this syndemic. So, you know, Gary can also respond to questions if anyone in the audience has them. But Dr. Reina Rusenko, a recent PhD graduate from the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at FIU, who's done research on homelessness in Tokyo and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, is helping me out today with the Q&A. So I wanted to see if there were any questions you wanted to ask the panelists from the Q&A. And, you know, again, I want to encourage everyone in the audience to ask questions, and even the panelists, if you want to ask each other questions, that would be great. So Reina, do we have any questions?
Yes, I think there's several that we have from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and go in order. The first question goes to the panelists who are based in Japan. The question came early in the session. Midway through the session, we did talk about the increase in homelessness in Japan, and we talked about some of the government aid. The panelists wanted to know specifically about what kind of increase in homelessness occurred and what kind of aid was provided. Daigo Kobayashi, just to sort of review, Daigo Kobayashi did mention that there was public aid granted to everyone in Japan. However, people who are homeless because they did not have an address, they were not able to receive the aid. There was no way in which that they could claim this aid without an address. And so organizations in Japan had to organize. And as a result, the government decided to allow for people who entered the shelters and therefore could establish the shelters as an address to claim the aid. This aid that was offered to everyone in Japan was just a one-time 100,000 yen money, which is approximately $1,000. And then as Kazunori Yui noted, this only was then available to people who were in the shelters and still couldn't reach the people who were on the streets. Also, going back to what Daigo Kobayashi was saying, he did note that there was an increase in people who registered for and started to claim public welfare. There was public aid that people who became homeless because of COVID, they were able to get welfare and sign on to that. So these are two public aids that people were able to somewhat access. Also, we have Kazunori Yui talked about that in Sanya in Tokyo, where you have a lot of people who are engaged in day labor. There were work programs prior to COVID that were stopped once COVID began. And these have been resumed, but they've had to reduce the numbers because of COVID. So this is what was already discussed during the program. I just wanted to allow the panelists in Japan an opportunity to possibly add something. From what we can see, it doesn't look like, and also Daigo Kobayashi mentioned that there was not really attention to what people who were experiencing homelessness specifically needed. I just wanted to ask, were there any other, now that you've had more time to think, were there any other adjustments made to public programs or programs specific to people experiencing homelessness? For example, maybe changed operations at the free shelters, or for people who signed up for welfare, was there any way to fast track them into housing? And or did the organizations in Japan advocate for any other kind of public aid?
Hi.
If we can get any information, yeah.
はい。そうですね。生活保護制度に関してコロナ禍の中で、まず一つは、申請してから、生活保護が、審査されて決定されるまでに、だいたい2週間から1ヶ月くらいの期間が必要なんですけども、昨年緊急事態宣言中の頃に関しては、これをできる限り早く審査を済ませるようにっていうような国から、各保健事務所への、通知が行きました。そういった、コロナ禍の中で、生活保護制度が動いたところでいくと、まずはそこがありました。で、これはコロナ禍が一つのきっかけにはなりましたけども、日本で、生活保護を申請する場合、扶養照会というものが行われます。扶養照会は、申請する方の家族に、役所の方から、この人が生活保護の申請をしているが、あなたたちが養うことはできないかというような問い合わせをする手続きのことなんですけども、ホームレス状態の方で生活保護申請を、拒む人の中には、扶養照会をされることが、嫌で、拒否している人が多数います。それに対しても、先月か先々月、つい先日、扶養照会を本人が拒んだ場合、しなくても構わないというような通知が回りました。これもコロナがきっかけでそういう動きが起きたのかなというふうに考えております。 で、また、生活保護制度以外にも、また別の、給付金であったり、一時的な、貸付などの制度が行われました。それは、社会福祉協議会と呼ばれている組織が、管轄しているんですけども、これも、コロナで、新たに、緊急的な、貸付金であったり、一時給付金というものが、作られましたが、有機的なものでしたが、いつまで経ってもコロナ禍が終わらない中で延長になってまして、ここからなんですけども、正直その手続きであったりとか、様々なことがこう当初より延長されていたりする中で、情報が追い切れないっていう問題が僕あります。我々支援団体間でも、あれってもう終わったっけ、延長になったっけみたいなことでかなり混乱している状態があったりしてて、そういったことが、困窮状態であったりとか、精神的疾患、精神障害、知的、障害などを、有している方が一定数いるホームレス状態の方の中で手続きができる人は難しいなっていうふうには思ってますね。で、10万円の給付金なんですけども、どうやったらもらえるかっていうところに関しては、住民票を設定して申請用紙が送られてくるんで、申請用紙を送り返したら、銀行通帳に振り込まれるというような手続きで、この手続き自体は、住民票の設定さえあればすごく簡単でした。シェルター、大阪の場合は、シェルターで住民設定ということだったんですけども、東京の場合はおそらく、施設に入所しないと無理だったんだと思うんですけども、大阪の場合は、シェルターは、基本的にはデイリーは、自分の意思で決めれて、長期間出る場合は登録が一旦解除されたりすることもあるんですけども、東京の、施設等と比べてもかなり自由度の高い施設なので、実際にこれ言ったら分かるかもしれんけども、住民票置くだけ置いて、そのまま寝る場所は自分の任意の、路上の場所で寝てはる人とかも結構いらっしゃったとは思います。はい。ですね。で、シェルター、はい、こんなもんでいいですかね。はい。
No, you can continue if you like, but I just saw Pete turned on his camera, so I didn't know if he wanted to ask.
シェルターの人で、路上の人で給付金はっていうところ、路上状態の方で、給付金を受け取れなかった方はいます。ただ、そういった方々に関しては、我々支援団体もシェルターに登録すれば、もらえるよっていう声かけをしたんですけども、そもそも戸籍があやふやだったりする方もいらっしゃいましたし、もう手続きが煩雑で嫌だっていう方もいらっしゃいましたし、またはそのご自身の認識の部分でそこを受け取ろうというところに至らなかった人もいらっしゃいますね。はい。そんな感じです。
Just maybe one thing that if you could add, I mentioned at the beginning that Seikatsu Hogo, the livelihood protection system in Japan, is maybe one reason that homelessness is lower in Japan than the US. Could you just explain very simply what Seikatsu Hogo is like and how accessible it is? And is it like a basic minimum income? Because that's something that's really being floated around in the United States as a more durable way to address homelessness.
はい、わかりました。生活保護制度って、正直私は、めちゃめちゃ、その制度に精通しているわけではないです。ちょっとお恥ずかしながら。で、生活保護制度、私の知ってる限りで説明させてもらいますし、もし、不足があれば、ゆいさん、ちょっとフォローしていただければありがたいです。まず、申請自体は、日本国民及び、特別永住権を持っている外国籍の方であれば、申請をする権利はあります。ただ、それが、申請が通るか通らないかっていうところは、役所での、審査、判断になります。その生活保護のアクセスのしやすさでいきますと、各、自治体にある福祉事務所にて申請することができます。 申請するときに、必要なものというものは特にないんですけども、ただ審査が通る、通らないということに関してはあります。少し前でいきますと、扶養照会を、されたくない人は、審査を拒んでいる傾向にありました。現在でいくと、まず最低所得なんですけども、生活保護で各地域であったり、暮らす、住居の家賃によっても生活保護費が変わるので、一概には金額は言えないんですけども、最低生活費を保証しております。が、これは年々減少傾向にあって、正直結構厳しい金額ですね。ギリギリの金額になります。大阪の場合、家賃、部屋の広さにもよるんですけども、家賃4万円の住居に住んでた場合、家賃も含めてだいたい12万円弱ぐらいが、支給されます。そこで家賃であったり全ての生活を賄う必要があるんですけども、申請時に、貯金が、たくさんある場合、資産ですね、不動産であったり資産がたくさんある場合であったり、収入が一定ある場合においては審査が通らないことがあります。また、居住実態が認められていなかったら、審査が通りません。要は、住所がちゃんとあることが条件になります。で、この点、大阪に関していくと、00物件と呼ばれている物件がありまして、入居するにあたり、なんですかね、イニシャルコストがかからない物件っていうのが多数あるんですね。要は生活保護の利用をある程度前提にした住居になるんですけども、まずそこの物件を、契約して、で、そういった物件に関しては、賃貸オーナーにも理解があるので、家賃は生活保護費が支給されてから、生活保護が支給されてからの後払いで構わないよっていうような、流れになってますので、まず、00物件で部屋を契約して、で、その足で生活保護申請、福祉事務所に行って、で、申請します。申請自体は、収入がどれぐらいあるかとか、過去の職歴であったりとかが聞かれます。で、大体2週間から1ヶ月の期間で、審査されて決定されかどうかが判断が下されるんですけども、各自治体によっても違うと思うんですが、大阪においては、就職活動をその間行って、誠意を持ってやってるかやってないかっていうところによって、生活保護の、決定の期間が前後するような印象は見受けられます。自分で仕事を探そうという意欲がある方は比較的早く出ることが多いなっていうふうに思ってます。なので、例えば精神的に不安定で就職活動に行ける状態がない方とか、携帯電話を持っていない方とか、いなくて就職活動できない方っていうのは結構後回しというか時間がかかってしまう印象がありますね。アクセスのしやすさに関して私からこうなんですけど、ゆいさんどうですかね。
もう完璧な回答ですね。
そう。
大体そんな感じなんですけど、そうですね。そうですね。ちょっと、生活保護制度の概要とかについては、詳しく説明してくださったので、特にホームレスの方に対して、生活保護を、ホームレスの方が生活保護を利用する上での課題みたいのを少し補足というか、お話ししておこうかなと思うんですけど、やっぱりさっき小林さん、扶養照会の話してくれたと思うんですけども、ああいった形で、扶養照会っていうのは、なんていうんですかね、家族とか親族に、ホームレスの人が申請をしたら、この人が申請に来たんだけども、面倒見れるかっていうことを役所の人が確認するっていう作業があるんですけども、やっぱりその家族に知られたくないとか、もともと家族と縁が切れてしまっている方が多いので、実質はほとんど意味のない作業になってたんですけども、それをしますよ、それをしないと申請できないですよっていう説明を窓口でされてしまうことによって、生活保護の申請を諦めてしまう人が一定数いらっしゃったっていうことで、その運用が、しなくてもいいということで改善されたっていうことがあります。他にも、水際作戦とかって言われるんですけども、生活保護の相談に行ったんだけども、生活保護の申請書を渡されなかったりとか、ホームレスの方だと、施設に入らないと生活保護を受けられませんっていうような、 説明をされたりすることで、生活保護の利用が、利用から遠ざかってしまうということですかね。ってことがあります。あと日本の場合は、その公的扶助の制度に対して、公的扶助を受けることに対してのスティグマがかなり強くて、その、なんていうんですかね、生活保護を受けている人は、お荷物だっていうふうに、世の中のお荷物だっていうふうに思われてしまうとか、生活に困っている人たちも生活を受けるようになったらダメだっていうふうに思ってしまってるっていうところがあって、それがまた、制度へのアクセスを遠ざけているっていうところかなというふうに思ってます。
Thank you very much. And, it's not a perfect system, but I think maybe the folks in the United States can learn a little bit from it. Goto-san, part of our project, is kind of an expert on this, and he's laid out the strengths of this livelihood protection system as being, it's universal, like you can get it based on need. Just because you have a low income, it's not like the United States where for disability, where you have to jump through hoops and show that you've been, all of these very debilitating issues. Second, the benefits come as a set, so you get money to live off of, money to pay your housing, and free health care. It's all in one package. And then the other thing that Goto-san has pointed out as one of the strengths is that it's fast. I think it varies by locale, but in many cases, maybe especially in Tokyo, when you apply to it, you get an answer within 14 days. It's not like in the US when you apply to SSI and you get rejected, you've got to find a lawyer to fight for your case and things like that. And I think that's something that maybe the U.S. system might be able to learn from. But Reina, I don't know if you have other questions from the audience.
We do, yes. We have 2 more rounds, I believe. One is, and this would go to all panelists, one of the viewers is interested in knowing how people experiencing homelessness were themselves involved in working, making any changes or implementing changes in terms of the strategies that were developed to deal with homelessness. And they provided the specific example. I think this is off of what we heard in Los Angeles with providing new new spots for hygiene. So with that as one example, how are people experiencing homelessness incorporated into these strategies for, developing new means to deal with COVID?
So maybe, Pete, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question. I know that your organizing really is with residents in Skid Row, and so maybe what some of the residents' kind of impact was on your relief efforts.
I mean, the resident impact was residents drove the mutual aid. They drove the mutual aid drives. It was residents. I think one of the things. So we're based in downtown Los Angeles in Skid Row. And our building is called the LA Can Justice and Wellness Center. And so we're doing organizing. We have rooftop gardens. We have opportunities for folks just to come together, creatively as well as politically. And when we had to shut the doors, it was one of the hardest things ever because folks who had no other place to go, right? Because Skid Row is like one big family. Being unable to come to the office and gain access, because of course, while we were providing mutual aid and we were providing these services, we were still looking at making sure that there was never more than 20%, that we were never more than 20% of capacity on site, right? And so one of the hardest things for us was to watch our community not have access to a broader community that we built. But in terms of the mutual aid work, it's been residents, right? It's been residents who know, who in the community really needs assistance, who can't come to LA Can, making sure that we're delivering It's residents that were holding up the food drives and the food lines. It's residents who were doing all the public health education. These were all just leaders in the community. I say, the one thing that has been the hardest, though, is not having that safe space. That space being the LA County Justice and Wellness Center for folks just to come and hang and get creative.
Yeah, it sounds like that cuts across all four cities. LA Can, you can walk right in front of it on the streets of Skid Row, and I've just walked in the office and picked up pamphlets and stuff and get information on what's going on and things like that. And one thing that I've been able to see on social media is that, and this isn't just LA Can, but other groups too, is these mutual aid efforts. You can make it fun too. You can bring in culture, music, and you've done quite a great job with that. Maybe Hilda could also say something. I know from a little bit of a different kind of facility where you have a big congregate living place and it can be intense amid the pandemic. How were you able to incorporate, the views of residents themselves and on how to respond?
So, one thing we started doing from the very beginning almost is we started having our administrative staff presence 7 days a week. So on Saturdays and Sundays, when there's a lot less programming, the case management's not going on or what have you, we have our top administrators walking the facility. And there is one thing that, we're very blessed in Miami is our homeless are pretty good advocates for themselves. And so whenever there was an issue, they let us know about it. Let me give you an example. When we started saying, listen, we want you guys to, when the pandemic was peaking, we said we'd like people to stay on campus unless they have a real good reason to go off. For example, if you have a doctor appointment, a court date, if you've got to go to work, of course we're going to let you go. But if you have no meaningful reason to leave, we'd like you to stay on site. Well, a lot of folks came to us and said, well, but I need to go to the corner grocery store because I like Cool Ranch Doritos, and and I can't get Cool Ranch Doritos or whatever it was, or I smoke cigarettes and I'd like to go get cigarettes. So, when they told us that was the issue, what we did? We opened a commissary. We literally staffed our own commissary with my HR staff and my back of house people that, that are not direct client support. We reallocated them to run a commissary, and our clients were able to fill out, and they told us even what they wanted. They came to us and said, cigarettes, we applied for, of all the things, for a state license. You have to be licensed to sell cigarettes in the state of Florida. And we applied and got a license. We sell everything we buy at cost. We're not here to make money on this issue. So we are pretty much, I say, cheaper even than the Indians here that run all the cheap casino cigarette places. So, but you have to listen and you have to adapt. Does that mean that every suggestion that is made is implementable? No. But when they came to us and said, we want to do a chess tournament, they wanted to keep themselves busy. We're like, sure, when and how do we make sure when it's done, we make it safe and healthy? We bought trophies. We set up a whole day for that. We go and buy and hand out Sudoku, word finds, adult coloring books, you name it, to keep, our and books. We've had donation book drives and hand out books and what have you, so that we're helping our folks keep stimulated. We've initiated more NAAA groups during this time, giving a support system to the folks that are here. And those have been the result of recommendations from the folks that we serve. But the easiest way to hear and get the feedback and incorporate their feedback and their response is to be boots on the ground. It's not a suggestion box that they put a little slip of paper into. We walk around, we hear it, we respond, we sit in the dining hall with our clients, so that if something is being recommended, we're listening to it. And if we can't implement it, we can walk through and discuss the reason why it cannot. But feedback has been key, and a lot of what we've done, informing our clients so that they understand why are we telling you can't go out? Why is this way? Or why do I have to get tested? Or why do I have to be screened, or what have you? And the best advocates for our changes are always going to be our clients. Having peers be out there explaining to other clients, why it is that things are happening. So, it's been very important for us to have a very physical presence. We have a top administrator work Saturdays and Sundays, not an option. And we've been doing that since March of last year and continue to do that physically on campus. So every day of the week, there is someone that can respond to an issue or make an adjustment or make a decision on something that needs to change.
Great. Thank you. Reina, are there any other questions?
Yes. There's one more question, and then I also have something to close with when we're ready. The other question, I actually am going to combine two questions into one. One person commented that they're very impressed how in the United States organizations were able to mobilize a lot of public support. And so they're interested in hearing from all the organizations, specifically, did they discover or, find useful any particular strategies for reaching the public, getting the public interested, and getting the public to support the kind of work that they're doing. Also, in a sort of similar vein, another person was interested in hearing how the organizations were able to reach people who had become newly homeless, people who were not necessarily aware of what organizations were ever there, what sort of aid was ever available. And during COVID, there's, they're not going to necessarily have the same access to sort of running into information. And so did the organizations take any specific approach to reaching people who had newly become homeless? So just to review, there's two questions. There's interest in how the organizations reached the public during COVID and got the public interested in their work, and how organizations were trying to reach people who were newly homeless.
So quickly in Los Angeles, we really use social media a lot. And, we found that as soon as the stay-at-home orders happened, people were looking for ways to contribute, right? And so we really used Twitter and Facebook and our website to, one, show people what was going on, right? Immersing people in the experience, because folks wanted to figure out how to give. And then we had just very clear asks of people, right? We just every week sent out lists of things that we needed, right? Everything from tents and PPE and everything that I talked about earlier. And from that, once we started doing that for all of our wellness events, the support just started pouring in. And it just started, there was just really like a multiplier effect. Once it caught hold, more and more stuff started coming through and continues to come through.
I think at a time like this, you have to, as much as you can be an advocate, and you're an advocate 365 days of the year, every day of the decade, during times like this, you find out you've just got to, no one's going to tell your story more than you're going to tell your story. And we have a lot of sad stories to tell and a lot of stories of good things that are happening in spite of everything terrible that is happening. So I think, locally, we found a pretty decent ear from some of our local news sources, news stations that were willing and were interested in hearing another perspective on the impact of COVID in the community. And frankly, I agree with Pete. People were looking for ways to help. And, we were able to say, oh, you're looking at a way to help? Well, we can use the help because there's a lot of ways to virtually help people. You don't necessarily have to come here. And let me tell you, you want to talk about impacts to a homeless system? Much of the work that we do on a daily basis is done thanks to the incredible volunteer base that we have that comes in to help us with our clients, to sort clothing, to feed meals, to prepare food. And one of the first things we lost was that volunteer base, because number one, they didn't want to come to our facility. They didn't know what was going on. They certainly didn't want to get sick. And number two, we frankly didn't want them to come to our facility because we didn't want them to bring disease to our clients. So, there was like a little bit of a pent up demand. People were at home, some people were at home looking for opportunities to help. They felt like kind of frustrated not being able to go out and physically help, not just agencies like ours, but many other agencies where they used to go out and help. So, I think the fact that we were able to get the ear of some local news stations make the argument that there's a lot going on and all these subpopulations that are invisible normally. And again, the fact that so many people became so close to homeless or on the verge of homelessness that had not been there before, I think, the issues resonated for a lot of people. They found more people so more attuned to the issues. So the opportunity to show what was happening and the response, it presented, a positive story. Look, our infection rate, let me give you a perspective. We're one of the largest facilities. We have 400 people here. Since March 1st of 2020, we have had a total of 65 positive cases. 65 total positive cases among our residents. We have served thousands of people since March 1st of last year in 14 months. As a matter of fact, we have administered, and I can tell you, 5,538 tests, of which 4,010 of them were for clients. Our positive infection rate is 1.58, 1.59%. Remarkably low, shockingly low when you consider what the infection rates have been at different times, not just in our community, but in our state and certainly nationally. So, those are the good stories to tell. And that doesn't mean it's always been hunky-dory. We had an outbreak in December. We had 31 people sent to the quarantine and isolation sites at one time because of one person who unfortunately was sick and made a lot of other people sick or exposed them. So it's not always going to be the great and positive stuff, but those are lessons you learn, and you even share those lessons with the people that you want to make sure keep informed and understand the nature of this pandemic and the impact it can have in a residential setting. It's like the good news when when you're out there and you're doing it right, and your client and the people you're serving are as committed to being safe and healthy and help you with that and follow, and say, hey, yeah, okay, I'm going to wash my hands and do whatever. And then you've got the occasions where, wow, 31 people had to be sent to a Q&I site. What happened? And, how do we make sure it doesn't happen again? And, and we didn't get negative press as a result. I mean, Professor, did you hear about that? I mean, probably not, because there was an understanding that there was a lot of work being done, and part of that success at 1.6% low infection rate is because the people that we're serving are helping us, keep everybody safe as well.
Thank you, Hilda. Kobayashi-san or Yui-san, did you want to add anything? In particular, maybe Kobayashi-san, I was wondering, as part of that question, since a lot of young people who are vulnerable to homelessness or maybe living in internet cafes are hesitant to go to Kamagasaki because of kind of its reputation, what ways have you been able to try to reach out to those folks to come and access the resources that are in Kamagasaki?
はい、そうなんです。私は以前、釜ヶ崎ではなく、大阪の北区梅田という地域で活動をしていたんですけども、西成、要は釜ヶ崎から、5キロぐらい離れた場所で活動していたんですけども、そこには、たくさんの、若い相談者が来ました。その人たちは、西成は怖くて、釜ヶ崎は怖くていけないっていう風な、発言をよくしてました。釜ヶ崎にはたくさんのその社会的資源が集積しているんですけども、現在のそのインターネットカフェ難民であったり、ネットカフェで生活をしている困窮状態の人であったり、比較的若い人にとって、釜ヶ崎に行くことに対して、怖がっている人がいることが事実です。それに対して我々の方で今、頭を悩ましているっていうのが現状でして、できることはやっていこうということで、釜ヶ崎は、他の業界の NPO とかに比べて、 SNS やインターネットによる広報がすごく苦手としてたんですけども、これからは、SNS での発信であったり、ウェブを使った広報っていうのを、やっていこうという機運が高まっています。また、現在、日本ではYouTube で情報を収集する層が一定数いますので、YouTube で、情報発信をするように、していこうと今、私自身も努めております。それ以外に、気軽に相談ができるように、スマートフォンの、LINE という、チャットアプリでの相談受付なども現在、対応できるように進めている状態ですね。はい。そんな感じです。
Thank you. Just to give, I'd like to give Yui-san a chance to maybe add to these questions a little bit, like maybe about how you've been able to, I guess, get more understanding and public support for your efforts.
そっちか。ですね、そうですよね。ごめんなさい、アウトリーチの話ばっかり考えてたんで、あれなんですけど。いいです、いいです。せっかくなんで。で私たちの活動も、たくさんの人たちからの寄付によって支えられているので、そうした方たちにどうやって情報を届けて、サポートしてもらえるかっていうような工夫が、とても必要になってきています。で、なんでしょうね。僕らもともとはクリスチャンの人たちのサポートが多かったんですけども、そういう特定の人たちだけではなくて、そうですね、広く多くの人たちにサポートしていただけるようにっていうことで、皆さんお話しされてましたけども、ソーシャルメディアを使ったりとか、インターネットを使った広報っていうことですよね、をやっていったりとか、その寄付をしていただいた方たちとの、コミュニケーションをより、充実させていって、寄付してくださった方たちが、よりなんですかね、応援していただいたりとか、他の人にも紹介してもらえるような、コミュニケーションっていうのをやっていくようにしています。
Thank you, thank you. And Reina, you mentioned that I think you had one last thing for closing.
Yes, actually, we got several more questions in, and I'm able to combine a couple of things. So I still have the closing piece, but if we have time, there is one additional very quick question. The closing piece is going to everybody again. There's one quick question specifically for Camillus House, and someone was interested in knowing how the activities there are generally funded during regular times, and then if during COVID, there was any difficulty in collecting funding for what you were doing.
And so, Reina, maybe if you could, Hilda, before you start, Reina, if you could throw out the closing question as well, and then Hilda we'll just go around one last time, and Hilda can
absolutely
answer that with the closing question.
Okay, that sounds great. So, closing here, I'm going to combine two things. There's one other question. The last round of questions we went and we talked about reaching the public and then also reaching people who were newly homeless. The next question is how were organizations pushing for government to take further action? So that's one question. And then another person wrote in wanting to know what can they do where they are to become a strength for organizations like yours. So it might be, you know, in their local area or more specifically for your organization. What kind of things can people who are here with us right now, what can they do to help achieve the kinds of things that organizations like yours need and, you know, help become a strength for people who are now experiencing COVID and homelessness and COVID during these times. So again, yeah, to review what organizations are doing to push government, and then what our viewers can do to be a strength for the organizations.
And I know that our panelists can say a lot about both of those things, but maybe if you just take 2 minutes each, because I think we do need to end and on right on the hour, and just respond to whatever piece of those two questions you can. So I'll throw it first to Pete.
Yep, thanks, Matt. So I'm going to take less than 2 minutes. What the pandemic showed us is that the government definitely has the resources to deal with this crisis and other crises, right? The rush for some to open hotel rooms, the rent forgiveness, the rent moratoriums. There are definitely things that we've seen the government do during the pandemic that we believe needs to be extended, right? And so the pandemic has, in some ways, set a precedence for what we can push for. One. Second thing, just get in contact with our organization, www.Congress. That's Congress with an A, CANGRESS.org. There's plenty of stuff that you can do. You can support our organization in many ways. Again, Congress.org. We'll see you there. We'll see you on the front lines. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Maybe just to jump to Japan, the kind of closing 2 minutes comments, response to those questions. Maybe we'll start with Kobayashi-san.
Hi, ごめんなさい。もう一回質問を教えてもらっていいですか。
What can people listening do to support your efforts, and what things would you ask or try to pressure the government to do to improve their response in just 2 minutes?
OK です。はい、政府への圧力に関してですけども、2つあると思います。1つは、今、ホームレス状態になっている人へ何をしてもらうか。もう1つが、新たなホームレス状態の人が生まれないためにどうしてもらうかという観点だと思ってます。現在、ホームレス状態の人に関しては、とりあえず今、日本は、ワクチンの接種率がとても低い状態で、医療関係のお医者さんであっても今受けづらい状態になっているので、多分めちゃめちゃ後回しになることが予想されているので、そのあたりは、強く交渉をしていく必要があるのかなというふうに思っております。で、新たなホームレス状態を生み出さないことに関しては、現在大阪であったり東京は緊急事態宣言で、いろんな業種の店舗であったり、店舗ですね、が、閉まっている状態です。中には保証される業界もあるんですけども、私の知り合いで、ホテルを経営している人は一切保証がないという話をしておりました。このままでいくとどんどん失業者が増えてしまいます。そうなると、私たちを必要とする人がどんどん増えてきてしまうので、そうはならないように、政府の方で、失業した人のフォローケアであったり、失業しないような取り組みというものを、行っていっていただきたいと思ってます。で、皆さんができることに関しては、先ほどヒルダさんが言ってたんですけども、我々の仕事ってね、お医者さんとかではないものの、とても重要で必要な仕事だと思っています。ただ、世間の認識っていうのは全くそういうふうには見られていないのかなと。日本ではエッセンシャルワーカーっていう言葉があって、アメリカではちょっとわからないですけど、そこに我々の仕事ってあまり入ってこないんですけども、そういう認識をしてもらえたらありがたいなというところと、かといって人的リソースに関しては、感染の観点から難しいんですけども、資金的な支援であったりとか、また、自分の近くにいる人で困っている人がいたときに、悩まずに相談機関であったり支援団体を頼るようなアドバイス、我々への情報、我々の存在を伝えていただければありがたいなというふうに思っています。はい。
Thank you very much. Hilda? still have Hilda.
So, so a couple of things. I'm answering the question, by the way, Reina, online on the funding. You know, about 55% of our funding is governmental funding. And, you know, ironically enough, we were in the middle of a budget year. So most of that funding did not get impacted, 55% of it. The other 45% we raise privately. As you can imagine, a big challenging thing, which we have seen before in countries that have dealt with big natural disasters, and we all have, right? You see often that those private sources get shifted to address those emergencies. That is the good news, but can also be the bad news, because, you know, Foundation A gives out $500,000 each year, and agencies like us get $30,000, $40,000 to support our operations. Well, this pandemic comes, they don't add more money. They just take that 500,000 and then they say, but we're only going to use it for COVID. So now, great, they're going to cover my COVID related expenses, but I still need that $30,000 to operate my facility. So it's like the good news and the bad news. Yes, there has been some funding, some cases new funding that has been thrown into the pot for organizations like ours to go and recuperate our costs. Our expenses hover above $600,000 to $650,000. We're an NGO. It's not as if we are flush full of people and can afford it. And again, it's the opposite. We had to stay open. We had to bring more staff on site because we had more people on campus at all times that we had to, you know, provide services for. So it has been a humongous stress and strain on our finances because, you know, we're not selling widgets. I mean, and right now probably selling something might not be a good idea depending on what you're selling, but at the end of the day, it's been financially difficult. You know, we have to constantly be stressing to government officials that we are part of the solution. We are not part of the problem. Homelessness existed before COVID. It has not gotten better during COVID, and God willing, and will not get worse after, you know, we are able to get past this. But, you know, we are spending a significant amount of time, you know, pushing back to federal agencies or governmental entities that are giving out money with strings that are not making it easy for us to serve the people we need to serve. And the only people that can explain that are the practitioners, not some person in an office building who thinks up these ideas of how we should be giving out money to help the poor and needy, but people out on the street that are seeing the impact of these restrictions not allowing us to get the resources to the people who need the help. So, you know, we've got to be the squeaky wheel. We have no choice. But us in the trenches, right? You know, we live with having to be the squeaky wheel, the ones that have to be the voice for the voiceless so that they can get the services that we need. We have to be the ones out there, you know, raising our hand and standing up at the podium and insisting to be heard. And by the way, yes, and including, you know, our people are essential workers. Where did that get lost in the translation? What essential services do we provide? Because trust me, for the people that we're serving in our facilities, for the street homeless that are being served today, we are the most essential worker they're going to be meeting with in the next few days when we provide them food or a vaccine, a shot, a blanket, a tent, or what have you.
Thank you, Hilda. And maybe last, Yui-san, a few of your comments on maybe what government can do and what listeners could do to maybe support Sanyukai.
ありがとうございます。そうですね、政府の支援、どのような支援が必要かっていうのは多分皆さんが大体話してくれたのもあると思うので、その政府にどう向き合っていけばいいか、アクションを起こしてもらうために僕らが何をすればいいかっていうことを少し話しようと思うんですけども、もちろん今まで皆さんがおっしゃったように、不正とか過ちがあったときに抗議をしていくっていうことも、すごい大事なことだと思うんですけども、一方で、全てのその不正とか、過ちとか間違いとか、問題が悪意から生じているものかというとそうでもないような気がしています。で、例えば財源の問題、税金が足りなくてできないとか、 システム上の問題によってできないっていうことがあれば、じゃあそれをどうやったら解決していくことができるのかってことを一緒に考えていったりとか、解決策を提案していくっていうことも我々ができるアクションというか働きかけなのかなというふうに思っていました。例えばそのワクチンの話出てましたけども、この間やっぱりそのホームレスの人たちに対してワクチンをどうやって接種していくかっていう話で、特別定額給付金の時はやっぱりその住民票っていうのが一つの基準になってしまったんですけども、公衆衛生の問題でもあるので、なんとかしてホームレスの人にも接種したいっていうような、相談が行政からあったわけなんですけども、っていう時に、例えばその住民票があるところじゃなくても接種券クーポンがもらえればいいわけだから、クーポンが届くような住所さえ書ければいいっていうような解決策を一緒に考えていったりとか、それを実際やるためにはどういうふうなシステムを作っていったらいいのかっていうことを話し合っていくみたいなことがあったんですけども、そんな形でやれたらいいのかなって思ってます。で、そうですね、三遊会、そうですね、三遊会の、応援もすごいしてほしいんですけども、一方で、なんかごめんなさい、せっかくマットさんがそんないい話を振ってくださったのに、無駄にしちゃうかもしれないんですけども、僕らみたいな、NPO とか取り組みが必要がなくなることって一番いいじゃないですか。そのために、やっぱり、皆さんって今日皆さんどんな方たちが聞いてるのかってよくわからないんですけども、やっぱり例えば日本でいう生活保護制度一つとっても、みんなが利用したいと思えるような、利用してもいいなって思えるような制度にしていくために、もっとこうしてほしいとかこうだったらいいのになっていうふうな声を上げていくというか、そういう社会システムとか社会制度を作っていくのは政府とか国の、もちろん責任でもあり役割でもあるんですけども、一方で僕らの役割とか責任でもあるっていうような考えで、声を上げていったりとか、意見を伝えていくっていうことができるといいなっていうふうに思ってます。
Thank you very much, Yui-san. I think we've reached time, but thank you all so much for, especially the panelists, for all your great work and for taking the time to let us learn about it. And thank you for the audience for listening and for all your questions. And I encourage you to support these organizations. Their links are in that handout. Reach out to them, volunteer, donate if you can. Thank you to the interpreters and all the staff at FIU helping out. So I think that this concludes this webinar. So everyone have a great rest of the day or evening. Thank you very much.
See you, Matt.
Thank you, everybody. See you. Take care.
Take
ありがとう
care.
ございました。
ありがとうございました。
どうもありがとうございました or something like that. I tried.
And muchas gracias. So, Rigo, are you going to shut us down?